I'm delighted to welcome you to the Oksenberg panel, which is an event that we hold annually to honor the legacy of the late Michael Oksenberg. I think that a lot of you probably know who he is, but he was a champion of U.S., Asia, especially China engagement. He was a senior fellow at FSI as well as at APARC. And this year, we're delighted that we could fold this event into the 40th anniversary of APARC. Mike was one of the most influential scholars on China, but I think that what I'd like to stress is that, particularly because I am one of his students, that he, I think, was one of the most influential and trained the largest number of students who went on to be professors on Chinese politics. And we have a number of them in this room, so I wanted to stress that fact. And as a matter of fact, he first taught at Stanford, and I think this is where Mike Lampton first met him.
As an undergraduate.
As an undergraduate. He then went on to Columbia University, and then finally to Michigan, where I was fortunate enough to be one of his students. And the group at Michigan was particularly large, so large that it became known as the Michigan Mafia, and we're still sort of ruling the country and out into the rest of the world. So it was really an unexpected honor and delight that Michael Oksenberg and I would be colleagues at Stanford starting in the late 1990s, when Stanford, thanks to Condoleezza Rice, made a big push and hired a number of China specialists at once. And I think that Mike was someone who moved effortlessly between academia, policy, and politics. He joined the member of the Carter administration in 1977, was a senior staff member on the National Security Council, and then played a key role in establishing relations between the United States and China beginning in 1979. He then went on to advise subsequent presidents on China policy. And I think something very important, he was, regardless, throughout the good and tough times, he was always for strengthening relationships and sort of ensuring constructive engagement with China. And I think that enthusiasm and his efforts motivated, inspired many stakeholders across multiple sectors. I was hoping, and David Oksenberg, his son, was supposed to be with us, but because of a last-minute emergency, he's unable to join us. Almost in every one of these events, a member of the Oksenberg family comes to, always is very excited to come to these events. And for today, we are highlighting individuals who have advanced U.S.-Asia dialogue and in the question about U.S.-China relations. And so the big question, clearly, I don't think any of us can read any newspaper without knowing the importance of this topic. But the big question I think so many of us have is, where is this relationship going? And that, of course, is the topic of today's panel. And now I'm going to actually turn over the proceedings to my esteemed colleague, Tom Fingar, who is going to introduce the panel along with the panelists. And Tom, let me just first say a few words about Tom. Tom, very much like Mike, is has his PhD in political science, a student of John Lewis's from Stanford, but then he went on to spend about 3 decades in Washington, distinguished himself in a number of different positions before coming back to Stanford to be an APARC fellow in FSI. And among his many positions, I'm just going to name 2. He was the first deputy director of national intelligence for Analysis, as well as the chairman of the National Intelligence Council. He's also written many books, and I'm happy to say that we also co-authored one on China called Fateful Decisions that I think is actually doing quite well. But if you want to read about his time in Washington, he just came out with a book called From Mandate to Blueprint, Lessons from Intelligence Reform. So with that, Tom, I'm going to turn it over to you, and thank you.
Thank you, Jean, for the introduction. As the moderator, I don't deserve that. If it's not out of line, I would like to add my congratulations for the APARC 40th anniversary. I was present at the creation, 1983. I was present at the creation of the predecessor, which was the U.S.-China Relations Program, established in 1975. Work on, in, and with China. And I am delighted and honored to be the moderator for the Oksenberg Lecture, which we sometimes do as an individual, sometimes with a panel. That Mike Oksenberg was a friend. Mike Oksenberg also used APARC in its U.S.-China relations guise as a part of the normalization process with China. That's a story for a different event, but while he was in the White House, the Carter White House, he used people here at Stanford and the U.S.-China relations program and me in a lot of the trial ballooning and the negotiations that resulted in normalization. His commitment to the relationship was as strong as his commitment to scholarship and to training new scholars. That we have terrific panelists who grow out of the programs that Mike Oksenberg helped to establish or to nurture. I never actually worked with him as a student, but Mike told me many times that he was on the committee that admitted me to the PhD program at Stanford before he left for Columbia. I never got a clear answer of whether my arrival was the reason for his departure. All members of this panel, and I'll introduce them in a second, have a Stanford connection. We didn't pick them because of the Stanford connection. We picked them because they are exceptionally good in the work that they do on U.S.-China relations. And it's no accident that they've got the Stanford connection. The quality of the work that is decades old, the quality of the people that we have as colleagues, and the commitment, repeat again, to working with China, with Chinese scholars, on China, on U.S.-China relations, is extraordinary and has been extraordinarily important to the history of the relationship, which, as we'll hear, is a very fraught relationship at the moment. I am always tempted to use, I will use, Mark Twain's characterization of Wagner's music as the description for the current state of U.S.-China relations, namely, it's not as bad as it sounds. There are those who describe the current state of the relationship as worse than it has ever been. These are people who are too young or have no memory. We killed one another in Korea. 300,000 Chinese troops served in Vietnam in the anti-American war. I was in charge of the China division at the State Department at the time of Tiananmen and immediately after. There have been rough times before. There is a floor under that relationship, but the problems are real. And we're going to learn about dimensions of that today. Our first speaker is going to be David, really Mike Lampton, classmate of mine from days of yore, Professor Emeritus and former director of the SAIS-China program, a former Oksenberg-Rohlen fellow in APARC, former president of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, and Stanford BA, MA, and PhD. And probably the past affiliation of which he is most proud, a former member of the Stanford Fire Department. Mike is going to talk about the current state of the relationship. Second will be Taylor Fravel, the Arthur and Ruth Sloan Professor of Political Science and Director of the Security Studies Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Taylor is a graduate of Middlebury, a former Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and a Stanford PhD. Taylor's work on China's military, on the logic, the motivations, the objectives of China's military policies is truly unique and truly useful for understanding how they see us, how they respond to us, and a corrective to a tendency to imagine rather than investigate Chinese intentions. Our third speaker is Oriana Mastro, who is a fellow in APARC and in FSI. She is senior fellow in, not non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. She is a reserve officer in the United States Air Force, specializes in U.S.-China relations, in China's military and security policies. So Mike is going to set the stage with the current situation. Taylor is going to look at the balancing strategies, so the way in which each side attempts to address its concerns about the other. And Oriana is going to look at China's strategy, raise questions about its continued efficacy and viability and what that might mean. So I will get out of the way, turn the podium over to Mike Lampton, and thank you all for coming. I think you are in for kind of a downer, but an incredibly informative, instructive panel.
Well, good afternoon. Good to be here. And thank you. I want to second what Tom said. Thank you for coming, giving us an opportunity to talk about our views on a very important issue. I would agree with Tom because he ended by saying this might be a downer panel in general. I do think there is a floor on the relationship. The question is where and how much lower it's going to be than we are today. But we are creating human resources, and Stanford has, and there are millions of people in both of our societies who have invested in this relationship, and they and their intellectual heirs will be the plug into which, when we both get to better days, they'll play an enormous role in that hookup whenever that happens. So what we do today and the connections we make are not in vain, but it may be quite a while before we're into a positive mode. That's kind of what I'd want to create as an overall set of attitudes. I also want to say something about Mike Oksenberg by first saying I wish his son David, who always comes, was able to be here. Mike and his son had a very special relationship, and my wife and I used to babysit for David, so I always look forward to seeing him and his family. Also, I want to thank Ji Wok Shin for not only all the work you put into this, but for all the kindness you extended me when I was here at Stanford. It was a wonderful time, and I want to congratulate APARC on its 40th anniversary. It's really a wonderful history. I thought that video was terrific. I guess the first thing I want to say, Mike left us a policy and intellectual heritage, and that was about really, he's associated with his state-to-state normalization. But Mike was really about society-to-society normalization, plugging in various levels, thinking the more intertwined we would become in the more functional areas, more social sectors, more bureaucracies, the more stable this relationship would be. And I think over the long run, I think we'll see the wisdom of that. But he would be very, I think, disturbed to see the degree to which the rapidity with which our society-to-society relationship right now is weakening. And I just want to, so his vision really is in some jeopardy now and for an indeterminate period. And we see this in at a variety of ways. I started my career at Ohio. The Ohio governor at the time was James Rhodes, a Republican. He was an enthusiast to create economic and intellectual relationships between the state of Ohio. I was just out giving a speech in Ohio, and I was doing so against the background of the state legislature considering a bill, Senate bill, the Assembly, 83, that would in effect end all public educational institution relationships with China. You're going to other states and you're seeing land laws getting passed or at least considered. I imagine a lot of this legislation in the end is symbolic and won't go anywhere, but some of it's going to stick. So you see it at that level. You see the numbers are always rough when talking about American students in China, but roughly speaking, that peaked out at about 11,000, and now the number's somewhere around 350. Don't want to hang in there for the exactitude, but the magnitude, I'm pretty sure, is in the ballpark. You see declining PRC, private sector and not public sector investment from the PRC in the US precipitously declining. You see public opinion polls, and we'll concede China's public opinion polls are more unreliable, to put it mildly, than American, but the degree of hostility, distrust among citizens in our two societies is going up substantially. And also, of course, obviously, we can't be called anything other than an arms race. So what I'm trying to say is this fabric at all these levels is beginning to pull apart. And that's certainly not the vision Mike had of what normalized relations between the United States and China would mean. Now, I want to make three crisp points because I really want to hear what my colleagues have to say. But point one would generally be that while you've been reading in the last few days, the last week, some encouraging signs and news about renewal of dialogue between the United States and China in a number of dimensions, and I'm hopeful and I'm supportive of that. But nonetheless, I don't think that's the main trend. The main trend, I think, is much more worrisome, and I'm not an alarmist either by nature or analysis, but I would not exclude the possibility of conflict, kinetic conflict between the United States and China over the next decade or the period that we're thinking about in this conference. I'll come back. So point one is basically good news the last few days, but I don't think that's the main trend. And I'd certainly be happy to hear some other views on that. Point two is that China's policies are certainly not in the interest of the United States. I don't even believe in many cases China itself or the region in which it is, or in fact for the globe. So there's not to diminish China's policies, but I've got to say, I think the core policy assumptions of the U.S. as we're dealing with China now is, let's put it this way, counterproductive and pushing every button in China that is going to elicit a result we don't want. So I'll come back to that, but that's sort of the second point. Third, I think if Mike were here, he'd be thinking about what can be done. And I never like to talk about U.S.-China relations without at least making some suggestions on where we both societies can go. So let me just talk briefly about each of those things. First of all, the positives. We just had a meeting between the highest foreign policy official in China, Wang Yi, and our national security advisor in Vienna. And it was considerably, I understand, over the 8 hours reported in the press. But anyway, extensive talks, and by all accounts, they both agreed that the United States and China have to try to get back where we were last November when our two presidents met in Bali. So that's all things considered good. Ambassador Burns, our ambassador in Beijing, met with the foreign minister, Ambassador Qin Gang. He's foreign minister now, and they came out of those talks saying that stabilizing the relationship is a top priority. That's a good thing in my book. Finally, our special trade representative is at least scheduled to talk to the Commerce Minister, Wang Wentao, in Detroit at the end of the month. And it's certainly the 2017 trade war and our inability to move beyond that, if we can make some progress there, to my thinking, that's good as well. So those are good things. I think we ought to build on them. I hope that I underestimate the potency of these initiatives, but they certainly in and of themselves I would fully support. But as I said, I think the negatives, momentum in the relationship is unfortunately likely to overpower what's likely to come out of those. First of all, and why do I think that? One is that it seems to me that each of our countries has a core strategy that is unacceptable to the other, and that those core strategies are embedded in our strategic documents. And what strategic documents am I talking about? I'll just start with Secretary Blinken's May 26th speech. If you look at that and compare it to NSC 68 in 1950, that was an important document in the gathering storm of the Cold War, there's a lot of parallelism between Secretary Blinken's speech and that early document. I was quite struck comparing the two. But beyond that, look at the national security strategy of the United States. First, the interim in 2021, and then the final published version in 2022. We essentially have identified China as the principal threat to our values and interests. We have a nuclear posture review, and China is rapidly increasing its missiles and its delivery vehicles and its warheads. And our nuclear posture review takes account of that and is responding in all of the ways that we are familiar with from the Cold War. For their part, Xi Jinping, one of the first speeches he gave, talked about Asia for Asians. Xi recently at the National People's Congress in 2023 talked about containment strategy of the United States, the suppression of China in our national strategy. And both sides are raising their defense budgets. China this last NPC raised it 7.5%. The United States is on track, or last year about 8% or more. So we are beginning to align our spending and political support is certainly, I think, reinforcing these trends. Perhaps most important, I think, is sometimes our vocabulary doesn't make clear what has actually happened. we talk a lot about deterrence. Our policy has shifted over the last decade from reassuring China to deterring China. And frankly, the Chinese are trying to deter us. And of course, central to deterrence is threat. So all I'm simply saying is the strategic momentum is towards threat, distrust, arms race, mobilizing domestic support in each society through mobilization of nationalism and sense of threat. So that's why I say you've got this positive news, but the momentum doesn't seem to me, it seems to be working against it, and it's a judgment call. I hope I'm wrong, but I would expect the momentum to win out over the optimism, if that's one way to put it. So secondly, I made the point, and this is the second point, that I think some of the policy assumptions that are core to our behavior are misguided. And what do I mean by that? I hear the administration talk a lot about that we can compete with China and we can cooperate with China. Well, I read an interesting article by Chaz Freeman the other day, so I don't want to steal his idea. I'm giving him credit. But he did say there's all sorts of competition. There's competition on the level playing field. You have to start at the starting blocks, the gun goes off, and you do your best. But there's the kind of competition where you actually try to trip the other guy. And then there's the kind of competition where you actually try to take him out. And what, I'll let Freeman speak for himself, what I interpreted him to mean is we're towards the take them out or trip them, not towards the level playing field competition. And of course, the Chinese are doing the same in reverse. I've been engaged in the last 2 years off and on with a sort of low-key but high-level discussion with the Chinese. And basically, on one of these conversations not so long ago, he said, if you think we're going to cooperate when you're competing in this direction, you're mistaken. We're never going to do that. Now, of course, maybe that's what you'd expect from a foreign ministry related person. But the long and the short of it is, I think you can't expect very much cooperation from the Chinese when you define them as your principal existential, strategic, long-term threat. At least you have to ask yourselves, are those two things likely to coexist, cooperation and competition defined in that way? Second thing I continually hear about is what we're engaged in is a struggle between democracy and autocracy. Now, I recognize that there's a substantial element of tension between those two ideas. But if you put on Chinese ears, what that really says is regime change is an important long-term objective. And if you actually look at the new standing select committee in the House of Representatives, it's actually designated as looking at the Chinese Communist Party as one of its principal objectives. We had the Summit of Democracies, one of the first things the administration did. Singapore wasn't invited. I think we need to have a policy in the world that can cooperate with Singapore when it wants to cooperate with us. But certainly the effort to define the central problem between the United States and China as an ideological political system problem. We have our problems with the system, don't get me wrong, but you're not going to get cooperation from the Chinese if you define their political system as the central contradiction. And finally, I think we have to be honest about what's happening with respect to Taiwan policy. We are moving towards, some would say, and I don't mean in China would say, we've really pretty much landed on a one Taiwan, one China policy, or dangerously close to it. And irrespective of the merits of that situation, that's getting very close to where the Chinese are going to be highly disruptive, just put it that way. So second reason I'm a little concerned here is that we are locked into policy propositions that are not, to put it mildly, going to maximize Chinese cooperation. So that. Point three, having said all of this, what can we do? Or what, and we includes China, has to be constructive too. It's not all us. But it seems to me that, first of all, we need a very high level in strategic engagement with China that starts with a premise. And that is, we both have to make room for each other in Asia. And that talks about dominance are just not feasible, as desirable as we might feel that to be. So we got to have a sort of shared understanding that we're both in Asia for the long haul. We both have to minimize the danger of that coexistence and improve the situation based on dominance is not a feasible objective. Secondly, I would say China has to reestablish what, certainly since the 1950s, was what you might call sanctity of sovereignty. China has really weakened, almost obliterated, its credible commitment to the basic principle of international behavior, the sanctity of sovereign borders. I take this to be a huge blunder by the PRC. And we can go into that in Q&A. But China's essentially going to have to put, I think, some pressure on Russia to restore any credibility to its, what I think is in its own interest, to recognize the sanctity of sovereignty. And thirdly, third set of things we need to do is pick some low-hanging fruit that exists in this relationship. That's why I'm kind of interested in what Special Trade Representative Tai will. We still got tariffs in an inflationary world, and the deficit with China's getting bigger, not smaller. So certainly it seems to me we ought to be thinking about what we can do about these tariffs. We've got we each closed one consulate in each country through retaliation. We ought to open it. China needs more information about what's going on here, and we certainly need more information about what's going on in China. Absolutely shameful that we haven't been able to cooperate on epidemic diseases, COVID being the most obvious. We both made mistakes. China made huge mistakes early on, not mistakes, conscious commission of non-transparency and so forth. But we made some mistakes too. We had pulled out our CDC people out of China before the outbreak. So that we ought to try to repair as much as we can in that domain. And then educational exchange, and I'll just wind up with that. The Fulbright program, we ended that. Now, of course, the Chinese, I think in some sense, see it as convenient. They didn't have to end the program. We did it for them. But long and the short, we've got to make an effort once again to get scholars into China. So thank you for your attention. I hope at least there's going to be some Q&A that'll be of high energy. Thank you.
So I will also stand. I'm on East Coast time, so this will keep me slightly more awake. First of all, happy birthday to APARC. It's hard to believe it's already been 40 years, and I've gratefully overlapped with maybe half of that. But it's a real honor and privilege to be here today to participate on the Oksenberg lecture or in this panel for Mike. Gene spoke about being his student. I believe I had the honor of being his last student, and I always think about him as both a public intellectual and as an academic advisor. And it's WWMS, what would Mike say, right? And if I ask that now, what would he say about our current situation? I think, I'm guessing he would probably be quite dismayed. Now, Mike had, I think, a combination of irrepressible enthusiasm and energy and optimism. And I think my remarks today are going to be slightly more, at least not optimistic, and hopefully at least enthusiastic. So I'd like to make 3 points. That's going to dovetail a little bit with what Mike just said. But the first is, right, that if we're thinking about the future of the US-China relationship, one way to think about it is what are the strategies the 2 countries have adopted. And I think essentially they've adopted balancing strategies with the goal of limiting each other's power. It's a pretty straightforward framework. But the second point I want to make is I think the adoption of these balancing strategies is going to form a new equilibrium and sort of be with us for quite some time. Even if maybe there are efforts to build a floor, it's going to be a floor on which more balancing will take place. And then finally, I think from a structural standpoint, these balancing strategies in some ways are inherently unstable, which suggests that perceptions of hostility and tensions are likely to increase, and maybe the floor will sort of get ever deeper. So first, starting with balancing strategies, I think it's pretty clear now, right in May of 2023, that this is what the 2 countries are doing. Just as a caveat, this is my analytical judgment, not my characterization of how the countries describe their own policies. Nevertheless, I think it's the product of the rivalry between the 2, which is and a rivalry is a relationship characterized by antagonism and hostility, and thus fundamentally a desire to limit one's vulnerability to the other's power. This just so happens to be, of course, the 2 most capable states in the international system. But we can view balancing across sort of 4 dimensions. First, military, right? The Department of Defense now describes China as the pacing threat, or when it's being slightly more polite, the pacing challenge, but the meaning is the same. Alliances have been revitalized in the region after neglect under the Trump administration, most notably with the Philippines, which is through a new agreement has granted the United States access to 4 rotational locations, many of them uncoincidentally not far from Taiwan. So earlier, Laura Stone talked about curated minilateralism, and I have an example for you of curated security minilateralism, which is AUKUS, the agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States to develop nuclear submarines for Australia. But this agreement is much a journey as it is a destination. I think fundamentally, right, it is sort of designed by Australia's location to sort of check China in the southern part of the region and to check China as it goes out into the Indian Ocean. But along the way, it's also going to be a framework for cooperation in the areas of defense technology with many more countries, right? It's actually going to be opened up, as I understand it, to others to participate, in addition to basing sort of U.S. submarines there relatively quickly and so forth. And we have a greater U.S. presence in the region, much of it quite public through exercises with allies, freedom of navigation operations, monthly transits in the Taiwan Straits, and so forth, right, that are all trying to signal this sort of balancing posture towards China. China's doing the same thing. It's continuing the pace of modernization to win what it describes as informatized local wars. The main local war, of course, would be over Taiwan. In 2019 and 2020, greater urgency was attached to China's modernization goals. In 2019, China had adopted a new military strategy under the very innocuous name Military Strategic Guidelines for the New Era, but it reflected a much darker or grim assessment of China's security environment, describing in 2000, or as the Defense White Paper 2019 described, there was a certain country provoking great power competition, acting unilaterally and strengthening alliances. So, of course, the strategy here, right, as I'm portraying, is China sort of reacting what it sees to be greater sort of U.S. challenges in the military domain. And then I think probably around 2019, a decision was made to significantly expand China's nuclear arsenal from sort of the low 200s to anywhere between 700 warheads by 2027, maybe 1,000 by 2030. And I view this, at least in some recent research that I have done, as sort of China concluding it really wanted to make sure it could balance the U.S. deterrent, right, and place the U.S. in a position of mutual vulnerability from which it could simply not escape. And previously, I think China's worried with its smaller force it was going to be vulnerable at some point to sort of a much superior U.S. force. And finally, in 2020, China identified a new sort of waypoint or benchmark for modernization, which was 2027. This happens to coincide with the 100th anniversary of the founding of the PLA and is one of 3 benchmarks for sort of China's military modernization goals, along with 2035 in mid-century. If we turn to the diplomatic arena, very clear, I think this is also what is happening. Alliances, of course, have been reinvigorated not simply for aggregating military capabilities, but for the political heft that they bring through greater collaborative action. We're going to see what comes out of the G7 in the next day or two. Obviously, lots of hints about the role in which China is going to play. We see the elevation and institutionalization of the Quad, right, which includes the 4 sort of main democracies in the region, Australia, Japan, and India, right? And this is not really a collective security agreement so much as, I think, a diplomatic mechanism designed to sort of increase sort of the collective heft of these countries as they face China. And then we saw much greater U.S. engagement in Southeast Asia and Africa, and even the Pacific Islands through summit meetings with leaders from each region, in part because these are areas where China was seen as making inroads. Turning to China, I think its most important diplomatic move has been to strengthen its relationship with Russia. I don't view it as a traditional security alliance because it actually lacks a collective security component. But nevertheless, as many Chinese analysts, right, it creates this back-to-back situation where each country can go out and essentially face the United States and the challenges they face from without having to worry about sort of what these 2 countries could potentially do themselves, given their very fraught history. And this, of course, culminated with the really detailed joint statement on February 4th during the Winter Games and on the eve of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, right, which described that there to be no limits in what kind of Russia and China could do. We see much greater emphasis by China in enhancing its influence in the United Nations, not only through greater funding, but also by taking over leadership of 4 specialized agencies. We see much greater focus on regional groupings, all of which have one common element. 2 common elements. One is they're in the Asian region, and 2, the United States is not a member, right? So this is a way in which China is sort of able to sort of enhance its diplomatic heft. And then finally, and I'm going to coin a new term here, it's what I call bi-multilateralism, and this is basically China's effort to conduct diplomacy on scale, so the China-Africa Forum, right? China can meet with 50 African leaders all at once because they've created this body, and they have similar bodies for Latin America, the Gulf states, Central and Eastern Europe, and so forth. Turning to the economic dimension of balancing, I mean, of course, I think this starts with the trade war, but also importantly, its continuation, as we heard about. We see in the United States, at least in terms of domestic policy, the return of industrial policy in the form of the CHIPS Act and the Science Acts, and more may come here. There is IPEF, which was mentioned earlier, and again, I don't know where it will go. It seems to be, as was described, right, sort of the framework for economic engagement, but premised on, American domestic politics, which means that free trade agreements are no longer really on the table. I think the most important act, though, was what is sometimes referred to as the October surprise, where the export controls and sanctions that were placed on China's development of semiconductors and, given the nature of a lot of the technology that was targeted on artificial intelligence. And this was justified as wanting to prevent U.S. technology from being used to enhance Chinese military capabilities, but I think the economic effect, right, is going to be much greater. And so I think if you were sitting in China, you would view this not really narrowly as a military sort of countermeasure by the United States, but really as something with much greater significance. A recent report by Goldman Sachs indicates that these export controls alone will probably create a 2% hit to China's GDP over the next few years, and it could actually be more depending upon how one models sort of the downstream effects. And of course, these sort of really comprehensive export controls, I think, are being mooted potentially for other sectors like biotech and quantum. Turning to China, right? China's really, shown its resolve in the trade war. It went tit for tat and all the tariffs, right? It was not going to yield. It's also continued, I think, more importantly, to pursue free trade agreements, even if one can debate either the depth of them or the feasibility. So it helped bring about the conclusion of RCEP, which I think is very important for the Asian region. And even ironically, right now is a bid to join the CPTPP, right, which was sort of the successor to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that sort of floundered at the end of the Obama administration and into the Trump administration. China's really significantly, though, expanding trade with the developing world, and I think this sort of is sort of the economic component of its bi-multilateralism. It's not just engaging all these regions diplomatically, but also doing so with quite sort of great purpose economically. And then finally, turning to sort of China's own domestic policy, it's promoted the idea of domestic circulation, also not uncoincidentally in the fall of 2020, when I think many of these other decisions were being made in China to strengthen domestic demand and create resilient supply chains to decrease its vulnerability to external pressure. There's another form of balancing, which I have here, information, stroke narrative, stroke public diplomacy. I don't know quite what to call it, but I think there is like a narrative kind of struggle going on between the two. Now, this was already described by Mike a little bit. China, is cast as, by senior U.S. policymakers as a threat to the existing order, and thus to the interests of the states that have a strong stake in that order. So China is described as, quote, the only competitor with both the intent to reshape the international order and the growing capacity to do it. And this sort of reflects concerns about being displaced or more commonly replaced by China as a leading power in the international system. China's really kind of gone on the offensive, and I don't want to talk much about the wolf warriors, but really more the content of the message. And so it's in the last few years, I think in response to being cast as a source of instability and a threat to the order, saying, no, America is the real threat to the order, right? We are the source of kind of peace and stability. And this spring, they really kind of went on the offensive. And so the Ministry of Foreign Affairs commissioned a number of papers, right, to help shape this perception. One, U.S. hegemony and its perils. I think that was my favorite. Gun violence in the United States, truth and facts, drug abuse in the United States, the United States' arbitrary detention at home and abroad, truth and facts, and then most recently, empire of hacking, the CIA, right? So like this is the message that China is trying to sort of send with its public diplomacy. And if you read the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs press conferences every day, which I do, there is almost always a planted question from a Xinhua or CCTV reporter, which basically invites the press spokesperson to say, please tell me something bad about America today, right? And then it gets on the website and it gets spread out. And trust me, just go look at the last week and you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Finally, though, China is also trying to advance a more positive vision. Most recently, I think this is called the 3Gs, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative, and most recently, the Global Civilizational Initiative. But all of them have this common theme, I think, of trying to portray China in contrast to the United States as really being a source of stability and development, and thus trying to appeal to countries for whom those are very important values. So moving on to my second point, is this a new equilibrium, sort of this adoption of sort of mutual balancing strategies? And I think it is. Setting aside whether or not it's a genuine security dilemma anymore, I think there is a structural spiral, an action-reaction dynamic that's going on here. A lot of the policies that both sides have enacted have no clear end states, which means that there's no real clear criteria by which they would be lifted. I think the semiconductor sanctions are quite instructive in this regard. They probably will only be lifted, right, if China no longer poses a military threat to the United States. Of course, the actions that each country is taking is viewed as provocative by the other, which invites counterbalancing and responses. And so I think we're in like this structural dynamic, which is why I think I share Mike's pessimism. Second reason is, of course, you have vested interest groups or interest groups that are created with vested interests in continuing these approaches. These can be both with inside different parts of the government as well as inside different parts of society. We're seeing, I think, this in Congress, unfortunately, with the creation of the Select Committee. And thirdly, of course, just the more general domestic political environment in both countries. I mean, to the degree, again, we can trust polling in China, Chinese views of the U.S. are at a low, and U.S. views of China are at a low. This means that the cost of unwinding these balancing policies, which are often viewed as provocative, is going to be very difficult, right? Because leaders will pay a domestic political price for doing something that might even should be done by the merits, right? It would be constructive. In other words, it's much easier to place sanctions on an entity than it is to lift them once you've placed them. Because if you go through the process of trying to lift them, you have to justify why you're doing it, and that would simply probably arouse too much opposition. So to wrap up with implications, so I think this dynamic that I've sketched out, right, is mostly a zero-sum one. It's not a very optimistic one. I mean, I think there is still some ballast in the economic exchanges. I mean, trade is not as high between the two countries, might not be as high as it would be absent some of the political tensions, but it's still quite significant. And a fact I always like to sort of reflect on is that U.S. firms in China actually, their revenue is sort of twice what, the revenue for their sales in China is twice what U.S. firms in the U.S. export to China, right? So we have to think about the fact that it's not just the trading relationship, but actually the role of U.S. multinationals and their businesses in China. So that may be the basis on which the floor is constructed, but I think there are two counter tendencies, which is why I'm a little pessimistic. One is I think when you're in this balancing sort of state of mind and this balancing framework, there's a tendency to securitize an ever-growing number of issues. We, of course, see this on university campuses in the last few years, and questions as to whether or not there should be students from China on university campuses, exchanges and collaborations with students from China, and so forth. And that's just one example. Mike referred to the various bills going through state legislatures to ban Chinese citizens from purchasing land in these states or attending state-funded universities. And China's doing the same thing, right? The new, and I worry about this greatly, is the new counter-espionage law, which basically outlaws any research on national security. And what am I and Oriana? What are we scholars of? We're scholars of like China's defense policies, right? So kind of everything we do is essentially kind of covered by this law. And we shouldn't be talking to people in China about it or asking, going to libraries and gathering materials. I mean, this is I think really quite worrisome. I think also there's a tendency, another worrisome tendency that when you're in this kind of zero-sum mindset, of course, it's very natural to raise the stakes or to believe that the stakes and whatever issues are being contested between are even greater. I think we see this with Taiwan in particular, but also with many other issues. Right, Taiwan, was described by a senior Defense Department official in the end of 2021 as a critical node in the first island chain, with the implication that it should be denied to China, which would, really contradicts the one China policy of the United States, but was reflecting the value that Taiwan was taking beyond being a democracy, beyond being a vibrant economy because of its position and what that might mean for the United States. But now we're also in this situation, right, where I think the U.S. looks at sort of Chinese aggressive moves towards Taiwan, not just as a problem for Taiwan, with which the U.S. has significant equities, but also, right, as a litmus test for how China will behave more generally. And of course, China looks at what the U.S. policy is towards Taiwan and views that as whether or not the U.S. bears hostile intentions towards it. And I share Mike's concerns that I think probably the central policy issue is how to shore up the one China policy such that all elements of it, right, are fully supported, not just supporting Taiwan, which I believe is very important, but also providing to some degree reassurances to China about what the U.S. won't do, right, which is to move to a situation of one China, one Taiwan, support for Taiwan independence, formal support for Taiwan independence, and so forth. So in the end, I think this means that there's limited room for cooperation beyond the cooperation that exists, and maybe the cooperation that exists will be gradually narrowed, and that when a crisis does happen, right, management of it is going to be incredibly difficult. I mean, think about the balloon incident, right, which, here's my pun, totally overblown, right? So this balloon has derailed, U.S.-China relations for 3 or 4 months after a very slow start from Bali. And I think only because there's an APEC visit in November are we, we're seeing, the next 6 months might see more interaction, but that was just a balloon, right? I mean, it was a spy balloon, yes, that was bad. It was overflying the United States, yes, that was bad. I don't want to downplay the significance of it, but at the end of the day, right, there's a lot of spying that nation states do at each other. Usually it happens at higher altitude and doesn't get filmed by cameras, filmed by individuals on the ground, right, and can't be seen. So this is very evocative. But I think any threat, any crisis that emerges between the U.S. and China will be right in full view of all publics, and for that reason, I think management of it in this context of sort of this adoption of balancing strategies will be very, very difficult. So thanks for your time and attention today. I look forward to the conversation.
I'm going to stay seated for my comments, if that's okay, just to diverge from the trend here. It's a blessing and a curse to go last because I prepare all these remarks and then all my colleagues say all these very interesting and brilliant things, and then I'm like, wait a minute, yes, I want to say something about this and something about that, so I'm going to have a bit of a hodgepodge of a response. But I think if I can generally put me in the range of optimism and pessimism, I would say that I am more optimistic than my colleagues because I had very low expectations to begin with. It seems like, and there's been some discussion, I unfortunately, never knew Professor Oksenberg, never got a chance to work with him. A lot of my colleagues had lived through this period in which there was a much more positive relationship, societal relations, interpersonal relations between China and the United States. And even during that period, Tom did not mention, but I was an undergrad at Stanford. That was my connection here. And even then, when I had taken my one course with Jean Oy on Chinese politics, right? But I was like 19, so I already thought I was an expert. So I took like one course on Chinese politics. I remember going to a speech here at Stanford in which a senior official was talking about how China was going to get richer, and then the people were going to overthrow the Communist Party and establish a democracy. And I remember listening to this thinking, well, that doesn't make any sense at all. Like, if you're one of the handful of super rich people in that country, why do you want to let hundreds of millions of peasants decide your fate? Also, all your wealth is like connected to your connections with the Communist Party. But these were very strong views at the time. And our expectations, I would argue, on both sides of the relationship were just too high. So if I can summarize in a very simplistic manner, my first job when I joined the military was I was a senior strategist at the Pentagon. To the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And my understanding of U.S. policy during this period, and now this is like 10, 15 years ago, was, China is going to be happy being number two. We just have to convince China that they're better off just doing whatever we tell them to do, right? And at the time, we're like, okay, so we can do this. If they join international institutions, everyone was relieved, right? Do you remember that? I remember reading all those books. Look at them. They join all these international institutions. Everything's good now. And at the time, the United States was primarily concerned about military threats. Is China going to take Taiwan by force? Well, what happened was it turned out China was better at pursuing their interests without using force than we thought they were going to be. Right? And so all of a sudden you have this, like, they are a threat to the international order. Not to say that the Chinese, what they do in international institutions is bad, but to the point that I think Taylor kind of made, which is there is no standard. From the Chinese perspective, there is no standard for what is an appropriate way to become more powerful. Like, what would that look like? China has certain interests they want to pursue. So from the US perspective, it's like, okay, we don't want you to take Taiwan by force. Okay, we don't want you to reduce their diplomatic space, right? Just through diplomatic interactions with their previous allies. Okay, we don't want you through international institutions promoting your visions of what human rights are. Okay, like at what stage from the Chinese perspective does it seem like the United States is welcoming to a more powerful China? So the US narrative, and I think the US government, at least, people in the government really believed it. So I don't think it was deceptive. But there was this belief, if China just rises peacefully, we will fully accept China into the international system. And I don't think that was ever true. I think there was a caveat there that the international system, as the United States defined it, is that the United States is the most powerful player in that international system. And so anything China does to threaten that is by definition revisionist and threatening. The Chinese always had this sort of suspicion, right? They were always like, I don't know, I don't think, I think at some point the United States is going to feel threatened no matter what we do. And this led them to have also equally strange expectations of what the United States should do, right? For example, when Xi Jinping came into power, he had this idea of a new type of great power relationship in which he was like, the two sides, yes, throughout history, you have a great power, you have a rising power, but the two sides can't avoid this horrible fate of finding themselves in a hegemonic conflict. I remember working in government at the time, and all of us lower-level people were like, they're like, should we? The Obama administration was like, should we go with this? Should we not go with this? And I'll tell you, I have a list of suspicions, but whenever I hear certain things, I have like a red flag, right? So when everything sounds really good, I'm always like, what's really going on here? And it turns out that really the Chinese view was correct. They wanted to avoid conflict with the United States, but the view was, if the United States just accommodates all of Chinese preferences, then there will not be a war. And from the US perspective, they were like, well, we're not signing on to that, right? So this Chinese view that they were going to be able to accumulate power, and also part of that is deliberately build systems and things in place that threatened the security of the United States and its allies and partners. You know, I remember a very long time ago being in a debate about, you know, were these threat perceptions overblown? And I work on military issues, so I'm very biased, right? Like, this was even at the time where people in economics, you know, everyone was making money in China, so they were all happy. This was before some people in the business community got a little bit more pessimistic. And I would just sit there and say, it's really hard as a military person studying the Chinese military, their doctrine, their strategy. It all revolves around being able to attack the United States and kill Americans. Right? Like, they're like, we're going to develop this particular system to sink, you know, this particular US ship. It's really hard from that perspective not to be like, China's threatening. I actually think that now we've all recognized China as a threat, and people are, and the Chinese, you know, officials I've spoken to, I remember a couple years ago, they were really confused because they were like, we've been doing the same thing for like 15 years. It's like, what has changed now? It really took like hitting the United States over the head, over and over and over again, with some of these very problematic policies before people in the United States were like, I think China's a threat. Right? So the expectation on China's part that, you know, the United States would be perfectly happy with however they wanted to pursue their interests and, you know, push the United States out of Asia and we would feel secure with that, that was too high. The US expectation that China would be happy being number 2, and my favorite kind of secondary expectation that China realizes that they're better off being surrounded by the US military. Right? This was the argument until very recently. Surely China understands we maintain, you know, the open trade routes and we keep Japanese militarization down. China just doesn't understand what's in their best interest. We will explain it to them, and we will explain to them that they are safer with us, just like with all of our forces around them. You know, now we talk about containment strategies, but in the 2000s, early and mid 2000s, the word the Chinese used was encirclement. And we would go and we'd be like, China, you're crazy paranoid with this encirclement stuff. But then you look at a map of China and you look at where all US forces are, and it's like, you know, there's a reason they feel encircled. So the expectations were crazy, and I think the balloon incident is a perfect example of this. A lot of times when these things happen, emotions get so high. And I just think, like, you know, of all the things to be worried about in this relationship, American people, it's the balloon that you're worried about, right? That is above you, not, you know, all the, like, these tests that China's done, all these, like, capabilities, this is the thing. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, then we get into this weird dynamic of denial that the two sides have, of these weird explanations of what is happening. You hear some aspects of this. I would say one of the major ones in the United States is China doesn't understand what's in its interests, right? Xi Jinping has overreached, and, you know, everyone hates them now. And, you know, and if they just did things differently, then they would be better off. China would be better off. Now, the one thing I often like to ask about this, not to say that Chinese behavior is good and there isn't backlash. Of course there's backlash. There's many problems with what China's doing in the region. One previously mentioned is they're being extremely aggressive in sort of territorial claims and threatening the sovereignty of other countries. But this goes to the previous point I think Mike made about sort of conflicting strategies, which is, can China achieve its goals without being aggressive? If you look at their goals about, you know, unification with Taiwan, with control over the South China Sea. Now, we can argue that we wish they had different goals. That's kind of a different discussion. But at least when I take a look at sort of Chinese strategy, I accept as a given what they're trying to achieve. And then I ask myself, like, are they pursuing the best strategy to achieve that? And so in the United States, we like to talk a lot about all the things that they are doing wrong, right? And, everyone don't worry, right? Like China's just messing it up for us. And China's doing the same to us. Like Taylor said, they have these different papers. It's like, we're like, look at this COVID policy. You guys are crazy. And they're like, you have over 1 million people that died of COVID and you won't wear a mask. Like, you guys are crazy. And we go back and forth on these different things about how both of us are pursuing policies that are not in our best interest. But I would say to take the emotional component out of the relationship, which I would say is the #1 problem in U.S.-China relations right now, is how emotional both sides, and they're not being actually very pragmatic about these things, is to understand that, just take as a given what the other side says their interests are, and stop trying to convince them otherwise. The Chinese are going to go blue in the face, being like, United States, you shouldn't care about the future of Taiwan. Well, we do. Like, you're not going to convince us not to care. We're not going to convince you not to care. And the other side of this, besides the United States saying that China doesn't, understand its own interests, is the view that everything the United States has nothing to do with China, right? Because China's just like a peace-loving country who's like never harmed a fly. It's all driven by crazy domestic politics within China, within the United States. Right? And so they point to certain things like the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex needs an enemy after the Cold War, and like we've just randomly selected China out of the list of potential enemies. My first job at the Pentagon, my boss used to say to me, your only job is to go into meetings and say, what about China? Because nobody cared. Right? In 2012, 2013, they were like, we're never going to fight a war with China. Look at our economic interests, and we got all this stuff to worry about in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so it was like, what about China? What about China? It's not like the military was sitting around being like, what I really want to do is create a threat where it doesn't exist. Now, there is some paranoia right now in the United States and in the U.S. military, which you hear aspects of, which is in the past 25 years, the Chinese military has now built one of the most advanced militaries in the whole entire world, while the U.S. force posture in Asia has changed about that much. And the United States isn't doing anything to change it. And so everyone's kind of in a panic, right? That's how the Philippines, which was like, a great move to get more access to the Philippines, it's like, that took a really long time to do. And so I understand the viewpoint of a lot of military leaders being like, war is coming. And I was just in LA, and my cousin, who's a colonel at the Space Force base there, say they have a countdown clock there that is counting down to the war with China. He was like, that's a little extreme, right? So it's not just like, it's because we hate China. China has done some things that are very threatening. And along these lines, we do have a degree of consensus between Democrats and Republicans because of that. I would say for very different reasons. And I would say partially for what China does, but also because of emotional reasons. So as a political scientist, I have to sort of have this caveat that I have no proof from what I'm about to say, but I completely believe it anyway, just based on my interactions with my colleagues in both parties. The Democrats, their feelings are hurt. Because you know what? They tried so freaking hard to be nice to China, right? Like during the Obama administration, they're like, we'll just tell you not to do stuff in the South China Sea, and you promised us, and then you did it anyway. And like, we're trying to trade with you, and we're trying to hold this off, and you're screwing us over, and now we look like idiots, right? And so no longer are people going to say we were wrong about engagement and all this stuff. Like, we are tough now. We are just as tough as those Republicans are, right? And the Republicans, it's like, the ideological stuff about China, like I can't tell you how many times they've been like, well, if we fought a war with China, that would give the Chinese people an opportunity to rise up and overthrow the repressive communist regime, which we can all agree they all hate, and they just want to be like us in the United States. And I'm like, it is much more complicated than that, right? And not to say that the Chinese people all love everything the party does, but to say that they are fully separated and the Chinese people do not support anything the party does, that's also, not exactly true. So we do have this kind of consensus between the two sides, which I would largely say it's like, the Republicans are saying we need to protect democracy. We need to protect, our values and ideology, and China, threatens all those things. It's like, maybe if we just focus on, doing what was right at home, then we'd be less worried about what China is doing in the rest of the world. So the last thing I'll say is things, are just getting really silly now. Like across the board with how the two sides interact with each other. I've had conversations with both. Like recently I had a conversation with people at the White House and, about there's no room for cooperation. And I was like, here's some ideas of ways we can break the ice. Well, we're not going to do any of that, right? And then I was on Zoom with some party officials, and they're like, oh, there's nothing we can do to reassure you. And I always come to the Chinese with a list. Well, it's funny you asked. I have a list of things you could do that would be very reassuring to me, starting from like the lowest level. Like, can you just have a dialogue with our Secretary of Defense at the level of the Secretary of Defense, which is at their vice chairman level? Oh, we can't do that. Can you just lift the sanctions, that you have on our, Minister of Defense for selling illegal stuff? Well, we can't do that. Like there has to be some middle road, and it is very hard to take the middle road. What I see in this discussion, which is problematic on both sides, is this idea that, the United States in some ways has overreacted. And so like things like export controls, the position on Taiwan, right? This is causing a problem where no problem would have existed otherwise. Like that is also not very fair given the fact that the United States had to respond to all these things in China. And on the other hand, this idea that whatever we do with China, it has to be so stringent. You have to poke them in the eye and undermine everything they do. I firmly believe U.S. policy should not be to undermine China's rise. It should not be like U.S. main goal to keep hundreds of millions of people in poverty. Right? We have to be smart about our strategies of how to compete. And maybe if we were less emotional about those aspects of the competition, and we're like, of course, these things are going to happen. And in that, this dialogue needs to happen with the two sides. And I would venture to say, as much as I like the idea of that low-hanging fruit, right? Like we've tried this a couple times. Like let's just do some stuff at the lower level we both agree on, and it will build goodwill, and that will help us with a breakthrough. I think we need to go the route we did in the 1970s, in which we go for the hard stuff and the tough stuff, and we come to some high-level leadership agreement on that then can build a foundation, for the rest of it. But in all of this, and we've heard this, and I'll conclude just by saying, understanding does not necessarily mean we agree and doesn't mean we like each other. I always dislike this sort of characterization of like, we have this conflict because we misunderstand each other. It's like, I think we understand each other's policies, for example. Like on what's happening on Taiwan, I think we both understand. The problem is what was said previously, there's a lot of difficulties with our strategies that the other side cannot accept. But what really disturbs me is this idea, especially in the defense community, the majority of people who work on China have never been to China and are not allowed to interact with Chinese people, right? Now the select committee was mentioned, the House Select Committee. I just testified that for them last week. I have potentially less of a negative view on that committee. One of the chairmen is one of my oldest friends, but we have disagreements, and I text him all the time, and I'm like, hey, Mike Gallagher has never been to China. And so I'm going in September. I'm like, you should really come with me. Meet some of these people in the Communist Party you're talking about all the time. And he's like, haha, like that. I mean, that can never. I get it. Politically, that can never happen. But to me, all the exchanges, and to Taylor's point, this law. I'm going back to China in September for the first time in 3.5 years, and. The party, when they invited me, they were like, don't worry, we won't throw you in jail like the Michaels. That wasn't particularly reassuring, right? My husband is like, I don't think you really have to go. And if you get thrown in jail, I'm not coming to get you. And maybe I'm overly confident, because of my clearances. I'm like, the U.S. government can't leave me there. I mean, they can leave any other professor in jail. I mean, Taylor Fravel probably shouldn't go to China, but me, they have to come and get me, right? Maybe not. But the point is, if we're afraid to go to China, people are afraid of interacting. And even if you're not afraid, most people are like, why even try? You're not going to have any useful conversations. You're not going to get anywhere. Like, why even do it? And now because of, all the anti-corruption laws, you're not even having epic banquets with food. It's like, why even go? Then that's a problem. And so it really is up to, I think, like the university system and academics to push through. Because, I haven't talked a lot about policy here, but those of you who know some of my work know that I have a lot of very unpopular views. I'm like in both parties, on both sides. I always say, like, I have something for everybody to hate. But luckily, I get to come back to APARC. You know, I go testify in the Hill, and I get blacklisted. The Secretary of Defense hates me. It doesn't matter, right? Then I get to be pragmatic and say, I know you don't like this idea, but this is what's going to be best. And if we don't have these centers in which, as someone mentioned about, Taylor's excellent work, that doesn't just imagine but investigates, and we don't have, interaction between the two sides to continue to build knowledge, and we don't have places in which people feel safe doing so, then that's when I think things are going to get really bad. So at least I am somewhat optimistic that we shouldn't expect too much of the two sides, but at least we should be able to manage it, so that we can continue to interact with each other and avoid a conflict.
Okay, good. I'm glad we could end on a note of optimism, even if it's obscured in a lot of, I think, realistic appraisal of where we are. That we're in a place that none of us up here like. It's worrisome, it's uncomfortable, maybe it's dangerous. But to bring back an expression from decades ago, I don't know how we get to a better situation from here. The question for any or all of you, two questions at the end of this. One of them is, what's wrong with this assessment? And that is that both sides find utility in the current level of tension in the relationship. And neither side is willing to take a first step, because the expectations of a reciprocal action that would begin a use positive dynamic are so low, and realistically low on both sides, that the potential of paying a big domestic price for an olive leaf kind of gesture are just too great. So what's wrong with that appraisal that suggests we're going to be in this situation for a protracted period, absent some deus ex machina? The second one is, who has more to lose from this? I mean, I would, at least for argument's sake, say that the Chinese are more fragile and more disadvantaged by the relationship, that the marginal degradation of opinion about the U.S. place in the role in lots of third countries, I said probably doesn't matter much, because we're the number one, we're the target. It's easy to pick on us for it, and the Chinese haven't gained from that. So arguably we haven't lost as much as the Chinese have at risk. So what's wrong with these judgments? Whoever wants to go first. Right, Mike?
Well, I think on this price, no one wants to pay the domestic price. I think it's good to look back to the beginning of normalization, particularly Nixon. It turned out it worked out well for him politically, and so we assumed he had to assume he knew how well it was going to work out, but he in fact didn't. He went to China, and Mao, it wasn't even clear Mao would see him. Imagine the headlines: U.S. president goes over and the top dog doesn't see you, right? He had an election coming up in 1972. He could have been accused of, he rose as in this sort of whole McCarthy period, and yet he's the guy that undoes the policy. So I think, leadership is about courage. And I think, there's a lot to be said about Richard Nixon. But on that, I think we've underestimated the political risk he took. And, if it can be done then, I don't mean that it's a totally equivalent situation. But I think there are advantages sometimes to the person who, is willing to take the risk and get some gains. And I think, given what we've described as the trend and where the floor in this thing might be, it's worth taking risks. And I'm saying that let's not be too cautious here.
If I can add, I'm trying to figure out how to say this like in a way that doesn't sound like too hawkish, but like some of the things that I think is like, often when we try to get the relationship to a better point, there's this assumption that there's going to be some sort of de-escalation, cooperative moves to get you to that better point. I guess, at least in the military realm, what I believe and what drives a lot of my work, though we can debate whether or not it's correct, is that because the United States deterrent has been eroded significantly, the conventional deterrent in Asia, this is leading to a lot of the problematic dynamics in which the United States is afraid of a war over Taiwan, it is saying and doing a lot of stupid things that then that then puts China in a difficult position in which they're wondering if we'll adhere to our policy. I do believe that we can either have a world in which China is deterred and unhappy, or happy and undeterred. And so I do think that some of the moves, some people mentioned it as an arms race. I see it slightly differently. I do think that the United States, there's certain capabilities that have to be put in Asia so that there is a balance of military power there. Because as political scientists, one of the reasons people argue that wars happen is because that imbalance of power, which leads one side to believe that they can succeed militarily against the other. And so I wonder if the way to get back to that better point is not the let's have maybe those from a position of strength. In some cases, you can make those efforts. And so maybe what's important is, yes, the United States is not going to get reassurance from China. I've tried to convince them, well, if you pull back some of these forces, or if you promise not to put 20,000 people on ships and say it's an exercise at any point, we will be more reassured. That maybe what is necessary is to create those conditions under which it seems like, conflict and war would be so costly, and then both sides can kind of breathe and relax, and then China stops doing all these exercises and all these military activities to show their resolve. The United States stopped making statements. We didn't do that for a long time because we were confident before.
Taylor, do you want to add anything?
Sure, I guess just 2 quick points. On the Nixon, for reference, right, there was great strategic benefits to doing this. And so the question would be here the great strategic benefit is not doing something worse, and that's a lot harder to sell, even if you can agree that that's the main benefit, right? And I think there's a natural tendency in political leaders not to preemptively resolve problems, rather than kick them down the road and they become worse problems later. You could think about lots of things that might have been headed off at one point or another, not necessarily in the U.S.-China context, but I think there's a tendency to wait unless you have a really compelling reason. On the who's more to lose, I guess my only intervention would be, I don't know. I'm not even trying to framing the question that way, but I think China's ability to tolerate pain, economically or otherwise, is probably ultimately higher than the United States because of the strength of the party and its ability to mobilize. And so I wouldn't, I guess, be so sanguine that it would sort of they may lose more, but they may have a higher ability to tolerate more pain, and so it's not going to sort of achieve the benefit that you were sort of.
Another way to frame it is, who benefits from protracting the stalemate? Not that I'm expecting an answer, because I want to go to at least a few questions from the floor. If you would walk to the microphone, state who you are, and a quick expression of the question, please.
Hi, my name is Michael Sun. I run a Metro Capital firm, but I'm also a Stanford donor. I'm curious if there are any lessons to be learned from President Emmanuel Macron's visit to China, which brought a big delegation and engagement, was whether to learn from the communique that came out of that. Thank you.
So I used to half joke, that the most we could expect from the Europeans if we were fighting a war with China is that hopefully they wouldn't sell weapons to the Chinese while we were doing it. I think I stand by that now more after that. I mean, it's not helpful. The Europeans, generally speaking, they have a very strong economic relationship with China, right? They have a lot of power. Europe is China's #1 trading partner. But the United States and European countries like France have different threat perceptions of China. And so this goes to one of the many myths, I think, that exist in the United States, is this view that our allies and partners, regardless of what we do, the allies and partners will be 100% behind us in any sort of conflict with China. And I always argue, like, I'm not sure that's the case. It's going to require a lot of work. So China has really laid a strong, in some areas, a strong economic and foreign policy foundation of convincing countries to prioritize those economic ties over other things. And in my mind, that visit from the French really exemplifies that even as tensions have increased between the United States and China, even as China has taken problematic positions with the relationship with Russia and the war in Ukraine, they still haven't maybe paid the political costs in all the, in all capitals that we would have, the United States would have hoped or expected.
John?
Yeah, I was a student at Beijing University the day that the United States and China announced they'd established diplomatic relations. And I do remember that day that one of my closest friends said, great, I can now get hold of Coca-Cola, which is, of course, the epitome of American culture. And he went out and he bought a can of Coca-Cola at enormous expense as a great treat for his girlfriend. So I asked him the next day, how did it go? He said, it was terrible. She was sick as a dog. This is what the Americans had done to me. Anyway, that was just a by comment. My question was this. All of you talked about relationship with China as if China was going to continue the same trajectory as it's followed over the last, 20 years. Growing military strength, growing economic strength, and a more and more assertive posture. Are you quite sure that's right? I mean, I think there's a counter-narrative here that we need to consider, that as we speak, that China may have hit an inflection point. We've seen the economy stutter, partly because of the mess they made over COVID, partly for other reasons. We've seen its geopolitical reach shrink as the war in Ukraine effectively bleeds its major strategic partner dry, and also as it demonstrates how dangerous it is to believe that just because you've got lots of troops that you can actually overrun other countries. We've also seen the constant ossification of its political system. I mean, Xi Jinping has taken not just total power in China, but of course going with that, total responsibility. Everything that goes wrong in China now is his problem. It's a difficult situation for China. China faces innumerable domestic problems, and as its economy doesn't really keep up, I suspect that we may see a change in foreign policy course. We're starting to see it already, I think.
You're referring to the Peking China argument, this idea that China's rise has sort of come to an end, and what does that mean for the future? I will just add my sort of quick 2 cents into that, which is, there's many metrics that people use, and China uses metrics for our decline as well. It is hard to predict. It is possible that their economic future, is bleak. But what I would say from a strategic standpoint is over the past 25 years, the resources they've had at their disposal to compete will, by definition, be less than what they have the next 25 years. Even if they have 0% growth, they will be in a better position the next 25 years in terms of power than they were the past 25 years. And they have been able to accomplish a lot from that weaker resource position for the past 25 years. So I think even if their economy is stagnant, there's still going to be this competition between the two sides. And a lot of the variables that people refer to, like demographics, those are lagging variables that the repercussions of that we're not going to see in my lifetime. But I'm not sure.
Well, one way to think about it is, well, first, 5% growth is pretty good, right? Like, if we had 5%, I don't know if they're going to get it in China, but at least that last quarter, was pretty good. But I think if the concern is China as a global power that replaces the United States, then I think all those factors are quite relevant and germane. If it is China as a dominant regional power that could eventually become the preeminent power in Asia, even slower growth and a lot of the problems that you mentioned will not really change the position in which it's basically been able to put itself in the region. And most of its main military concerns are in the region, right? I mean, Taiwan, South China Sea, India is not trying to create a network of bases in 40 countries to project military power around the world. And so I guess the other thing is, this is not a reasoned judgment, but since I've first went to China in 1992, and my story here is I went to the first McDonald's to get a milkshake that opened near Tiananmen Square after backpacking for 8 weeks around all sorts of interesting places. But yeah, there's always been this sense that China is on the verge of collapse or something is going to happen internally, and in the same way that American decline has been kind of predicted to happen every 10 years or so, I think Chinese decline is also sort of predicted to happen at this rate. I mean, what was Gordon Chang's book, The Coming Collapse of China? That was going to happen in 2010. And here we are in 2023. And so the party is quite motivated, and it's motivated first and foremost with staying in power. And it may be decaying internally such that it would have a more rapid decline that we can't observe, or it will sort of be able to sort of readjust and continue to at least achieve its regional objectives, which I think are ultimately the most salient ones, even if American concerns are often expressed in terms of China's sort of global potential.
Good. Mike?
I think that's an excellent question. It gets to my general feeling that, if you put it this way, no set of American leaders would want to trade our problems for their problems. That's the first thing that I think is totally obvious. And we tend to exaggerate Chinese capabilities and underestimate our own. That's at least my frame. But on the other hand, just in your litany of problems China has, which I agree with, we got demographics, which is one of the, I think, big problems, and total economic factor productivity in China. So the problems are even bigger than your question suggests. On the other hand, I think Taylor's got an important point, and that is if China can keep 4% or 3 to 4% growth going for another 20 years, that's now building on a big base that's going to change the dynamic. And I think it's entirely reasonable to think China could achieve 3% growth over, the next decade. It may not, but it's certainly feasible, and we should assume, I think, that it would. And also, as I said, many of the policies that we are pursuing is strengthening Xi within his own political structure. And so, the rally around the flagpole effect. So I think we have to, as a nation, assume China's capabilities are going to go up. It's going to have a lot of problems. And there's no assurance that if Xi left tomorrow, we got a better choice here from our national interest. I think what we don't know about succession in China would fill books. So anyway, some of my reactions.
Last question, Jingjing.
Thank you very much, Tom. My name is Jingjing Tan. I'm a journalist of China's Xinhua News Agency. I was a visiting scholar at APARC 10 years ago in 2013. So it's my great pleasure and honor to be back and hear the insights of so many world-renowned China experts. And I have been based in LA since the end of 2018. And since then, I have witnessed the downturn of China-US relations, especially the outbreak of COVID-19. As a journalist, I have experienced a lot of inconvenience and difficulties in our stay, as well as a lot of restrictions in reporting. The deterioration of China-US relations can be seen in all fields, including the decoupling of economy and high-tech industries, and the tension over the Ukraine war, the disputes in the South China Sea, the probing of the COVID-19 origin, among other challenges. And it seems there is no foundation or opportunities for top-level dialogues and mutual visits in the near future, which might help control the confrontations or manage risks. And a lot of people were pessimistic about China-US relations. As Mike just now said, the overall trend is negative and worrisome. And also, people, many believe that it's impossible for bilateral ties to get back on track and improve in the near future. And meanwhile, the possibilities of major and dangerous incidents are increasing, and bilateral competitions and confrontations in all fields might become more intense. So my question is, what is the single step that the two countries could take individually in order to help stabilize their relations? And how should the two countries manage risks on sensitive issues, including the Taiwan tension?
Thank you. Let's give a chance to answer the questions.
I can just weigh in a quick thing. You know, I wrote a whole book about talking during wartime, like during the most important time. China has always been, I don't want to say immature, but has always been sensitive. And when anything goes wrong in the relationship, they cut off talks with the United States. That's a standard procedure. But the United States has never been like that. So I was quite surprised when the Biden administration, you know, postponed Secretary Blinken's visit. I understand the impetus for reciprocity. You know, if China does it, we should do it. But since you asked what is one thing what's one thing one side can do unilaterally, I do think the United States should have an open diplomacy type of strategy, not only to China, but I've also argued with countries that we have difficult relations with. It makes just as much sense to double the size of our embassies as it does to pull, you know, personnel out of that country. So I think generally speaking, the U.S. position should be, you know, we are always willing to meet and talk, even with the frustration of the fact that China often uses that as a tool.
Mike or Taylor, any last words?
I'll just say APEC in November is a great opportunity. And I think Xi Jinping, if he comes, right, then he and President Biden can have an actual in-person meeting. I think we all know the limits of virtual interactions. Especially, I can only imagine a virtual interaction that then requires translation. So if there is an opportunity, you know, in the next little while, that's probably the best one to be seized. And so hopefully, I'm guessing the two parties are working towards making that kind of a visit possible, or the two governments are. But to me, that's where the best opportunity probably lies in the next 6 months.
Mike, do you have anything you want to add?
Oh, I think, though, that at the end of my remarks, I gave some suggestions. I'll still hang in there for low-hanging fruit. So.
Well, we have run over. I'll just take a couple of minutes to thank everybody who was here. Thank those especially who asked questions. I think our panelists have done a terrific job describing the importance, the complexity, and the worrisome aspect of our relationship. So the charge to all as we go forth to celebrate in a different way APARC's anniversary, to think about ways to improve or at least check the slide in this relationship. Now, a good task for everyone. So join me in thanking the panel. Nice job.